Senator Daines can get away with that because he is an engineer. Unfortunately, I am too. It's a curse and sometimes a blessing. I wanted to start out and talk a little bit about that term baseload power because we hear a lot more of it today than we did 10 or 15 years ago, and I find that fascinating. I grew up in a utility family where my dad was a lineman when I was young. He was a manager later. Those were the days when coal and nuclear and hydro were the only games in town. But I bring that up because I think baseload oftentimes today is more of a political term than an engineering term. And it tends to come up oftentimes at times when it's sort of code for trying to subsidize generation that is no longer competitive in the marketplace. And I would just point out that when those coal-fired generators go down, they're providing, and oftentimes that's unplanned maintenance, and it's not unusual, they're providing zero baseload megawatts to the grid. And we need to find ways today to think about our grid and meet supply and demand together and know what the weather's going to be tomorrow and the next day so that we can match those things up from whatever generation sources we're using. I want to go to Mr. Walker first because you said something to Senator Manchin. I don't want to misquote you. I want to understand if I understood you correctly, that inherently coal at a coal generating station is less exposed to the threats of physical or cyber threat to the grid than, say, oil and gas pipelines. And the reason why I bring that up is because from my perspective, once you use that coal to generate, you have to get it to the customer. You have to do that over transmission lines and then distribution lines. And it seems to me that all of these infrastructures are equally exposed to those threats. You have the same SCADA systems at substations and relating to transmission and distribution on the electric grid that you would use in pipelines. You have the same physical threats to both of those distribution networks. So I don't see the difference in terms of exposure in terms of critical infrastructure. Am I missing something?
No, that's a fair question, and I'll be. So what you heard me say, or what you reiterated, is what I do believe, and you know, the perspective that we're taking and I'm taking right now is DOE is focused on protecting critical national infrastructure, and you know, as FERC deals with the marketplace and when we focus in on the resiliency, the capability that provides that safety and resilience in the grid, if I have a stockpile of coal in this instance at a location for a sufficient period of time, I'm not placing at risk the infrastructure as if it were natural gas. So if we take the New England.
What if that coal is too frozen or too wet to actually burn?
And those are possibilities that were realized during the polar vortex, right? So and I think through much of the work that was done after the polar vortex, provisions have been placed at the utilities that and the generation plants that utilize things like coal to prevent, you know, through weatherization techniques and things like that.
So when I think of the polar vortex or even this latest bomb cyclone, if I'm getting that term correct, the unsung hero that I think about that gets very little attention is actually demand response. And so I'd be curious from the folks at PJM and ISO New England, you know, how important is demand response at this point in these sorts of events, and has a market been fully implemented, and are there federal policies in place that assure that demand response is allowed to compete as effectively as possible in these kinds of events?
So a market has been fully developed for demand response. We speak of demand resources broadly in New England, and I'd say there are two categories. The one is passive demand resources like energy efficiency, and that's very well developed in New England because of all the state programs supporting that investment. The active demand response, which is active reduction during system events and so forth, we have a lower penetration in New England, but the market exists. I think the issue has been the economics. It's not competitive in the market relative to some of the other resources. If you'd give me a minute, I just wanted to reinforce something else you said as well. I think there's a policy conundrum here with regard to this discussion between fuel diversity and fuel security. I think the policy conundrum is that the term fuel diversity is at odds with the idea of a competitive wholesale market, because it implies a central planning orchestration of the different resources on the system, whereas the markets, what you're really trying to do is create a competitive construct where the most economic resources come forward to produce the reliability service, which is why you don't hear us using the term fuel diversity. We use the term fuel security.
Correct.